The next morning, a pair of dump trucks pulled up and offloaded mounds of dirt on the sidewalks outside the glory of Mount Pectu. Being an interrogator usually got me out of tasks like this, especially with the flash of a certain badge. Not this time. Soon, I found myself in a human chain that moved buckets and jerry cans filled with earth 22 stories to the roof. All day, I thought of the cell phone in my parents' apartment, slowly charging back to life. When dusk came and the stairwell went black, I raced everyone to the first floor, but found myself last in line to bathe in cold gray water. For my parents, I cooked some mushrooms that an old widow on the second floor grew in kimchi jars. My mother informed me that on the golf course with the foreign minister of Burundi, Kim Jong-il had shot 7 holes in one. News of all the poverty and hunger in South Korea had my father depressed. The loudspeaker had broadcast a big story about starvation in the South. The dear leader's sending them aid, he told me, but I hope they can hang on until reunification. Now that the roof was covered with 10 centimeters of soil, all I could think about was getting back to Commander Gaw to see if he'd recovered. Not so fast, my housing block manager told me the next morning. He pointed to the edge of the roof, off the edge of the roof to a truck full of goats below. Because my parents were infirm, I'd have to carry their share. Certainly, a rope and pulley system would have worked best, but not everyone around here went to Kim Il-sung University. 40 goats later, I skipped my bath so I could race to the Yanggakdo market. It was shameful how little I got for Commander Gaw's ring. It seemed that everyone had a wedding ring for sale. Reeking of goat, I rode the subway home with summer squash and a 10-kilo sack of rice. I made a feast for my parents, and we were all in high spirits. In the middle of dinner, the amber light on the phone charger turned green. I toyed with it while we ate, scrolling through the menus. My father heard the tones that the buttons made. "Have you got something there?" he asked. "No," I told him. For a moment, it felt like my mother glanced at the phone, but when I looked, she was staring straight ahead at the fluffy white rice. Ration cards for rice had stopped months ago, and we'd been living on millet. They used to ask where I got the money for the black market food, but they don't anymore. I leaned toward her. I held up the phone and slowly passed it before her eyes. I returned to the keypad. It wasn't that I didn't know a phone number to dial. It was that only now I realized I didn't have a person to call. There wasn't a woman, a colleague, even a relative that I was close to. "Father," I said, "if you were to contact someone, who would it be?" "I have no need to contact anyone," he said. "It's not need," I said. "Wouldn't you want to call a friend or a relative?" "Our party comrades fulfill our needs," my mother said. "What about your aunt?" I asked my father. "Don't you have an aunt in the South?" My father's face went blank. "We have no ties to that corrupt nation," he said. "We denounce her," my mother said. "Hey, I'm not asking as a state interrogator," I told him. "I'm your son. This is family talk." They ate in silence. I returned to the phone, moving through its functions, all of which seemed disabled. I dialed a couple random numbers, but the phone wouldn't connect to the network, even though I could see the cellular tower from our window. It looked like I'd be selling the thing after all. "Hey, wait," I said. "When I was a boy, there was a couple. They'd come over and the 4 of you would play cards late into the night. Aren't you curious what happened to them? Wouldn't you contact them if you could?" "I don't believe I've heard of these people," my father said. "I'm sure of it," I told him. "I remember them clearly." "No," he said, "you're mistaken." "Father, it's me. There's no one else here. No one's listening." "Stop this dangerous talk," my mother said. "We met with no one." "I'm not saying you met with anyone. The 4 of you would play cards after the factory closed. You'd drink shoju." I reached to take my father's hand, but the touch surprised him and he recoiled. "Father, it's me. Take my hand." "Do not question our loyalties," he said. "Is this a test?" he asked me. He looked wide-eyed around the room. "Are we being tested?" There's a talk that every father must have with his son, in which he brings the child to understand that there are things we must say on the outside, while inside we are still family. I was 8 when my father had this talk with me. We were under a tree on Moranbang Hill. He told me that there was a path set out for us. On it, we had to do everything the signs commanded. We must walk this path alone on the outside, but inside we would be holding hands. On Sundays, the factories were closed, so the air was clear, and I could imagine this path ahead stretching across the Taedong Valley. We ate berry-flavored ices and listened to the sounds of old men at their chengi boards. My father said to me, "I denounced this boy for having a blue tongue." We laughed. I pointed at my father. "This citizen eats mustard." I had recently tried mustard for the first time, and the look on my face made my parents laugh. Everything mustard was funny to me. My father addressed an invisible authority in the air. "This boy has counter-revolutionary thoughts about mustard. He should be sent to a mustard seed farm to correct his mustardly thinking." We laughed. "Now take my hand," he told me. I put my small hand in his, and then his mouth became sharp with hate. He shouted, "I denounce this citizen as an imperialist puppet who should be remanded to stand trial for crimes against the state." His face was red, venomous. I have witnessed him spew capitalist diatribes in an effort to poison our minds. The old man turned from the game board to look at us. I was terrified, on the verge of crying. My father said, "See, my mouth said that, but my hand, it was holding yours. If your mother must ever say something like that to me in order to protect the two of you, know that inside, she and I are holding hands. And if someday you must say something like that to me, I will know it's not the real you. Inside is where the father and son will always be holding hands." He reached out and ruffled my hair. I put my useless phone away. That night, I felt weak, like my body was hungry for some kind of food I'd never tasted. I thought of the dogs in the Central Zoo that lived on cabbage and old tomatoes. When I turned to go home, I found the subway shut down, and the queue for the Kwangbok Express was 3 blocks long. I started walking. I didn't make it 2 blocks before I heard the bullhorns, and I knew I was in trouble. The Minister of Mass Mobilization and his cadres were moving through the district, sweeping up any citizen unlucky enough to be on the street. You couldn't run. If they even thought you were trying to avoid volunteering for harvest duty, it was off to a redeemability farm for a month of labor. It was, however, the kind of thing that a Pubyuk badge could get you out of. Without it, I found myself in the back of a dump truck, headed to the countryside to pull rice for 16 hours. We drove northeast by moonlight toward the silhouetted Myoyang Range, the driver flashing on his headlights when he thought he saw something in the road, but there was nothing there. No people, no cars, nothing but empty highways lined with tank traps and large Chinese excavators abandoned for want of parts. In the dark, we found a peasant village somewhere along the Chungcheong River. Us city folk, about 100 of us, climbed down to sleep on the open ground. I had my smock to keep me warm. For 5 years, I'd used a badge to escape harvest details, so I'd forgotten the sounds of crickets and frogs in the summer, the pungent mist that rises off the rice water. I heard children somewhere playing in the dark, and I heard the sounds of a man and a woman engaged in what must have been genital intercourse. What followed was my best night's sleep in years. There was no breakfast, and my hands blistered before the sun was up. Why we drained one field and flooded another, I had no idea. But the light dawned hard on the peasants of Jigang province. They all wore cheap, ill-fitting Vinalon suits. They had nothing but black sandals, and their bodies were rail-thin, their teeth translucent to the black cores. It turned out I showed too little promise as a rice harvester, and instead was sent to empty latrine pots, raking the contents between layers of rice hull. An old woman, too old to work, watched me labor. She smoked her own kind of cigarette, rolled in corn husks, and told me many stories, but because she lacked teeth, I couldn't understand them. In the afternoon, a city woman was struck by a grand snake, long as a man. They gave her wound a poultice. I tried to quiet her screams by stroking her soft hair, but that snake must have done something to her. She started hitting me, pushing me away. The peasants by then had caught the twisting snake, black as the fecal water that had concealed it. Some wanted to take its gallbladder. Others wished to milk its venom for liquor. They appealed to the old woman, who motioned for them to free it. I watched the snake swim away through a paddy cleared of rice. The shallow water was both dark and flashing with sunset. The snake took its own course, away from all of us, and I had a feeling there was another black snake out across the water, waiting for this broad swimmer to make its way home. It was midnight when I arrived at the apartment building. Though the key turned in the lock, the door wouldn't open. It was somehow barricaded from within. I pounded on the door. "Mama," I called. "Father, it's me, your son. There's something wrong with the door. You must open it." I pleaded. Finally, I just buttoned my smock and lay down in the hall. I thought of the peasants with their children and their loud intercourse, of how, except for starvation, they didn't have a care in the world. Beside me, Commander Gau's phone went bing. In the dark, I found it, flashing its green light. On the tiny screen was a picture. A Korean woman and her children smiling against a sunny blue sky. They wore black caps with ears that made them look like mice. Come morning, the door was standing open. Inside, my mother was cooking porridge while my father sat at the table. "Who's there?" my father asked. "Is someone there?" I could see one of the chairs had a shiny spot where the doorknob had rubbed it. "It's me, Father, your son." "Thank goodness you're back," my father said. "We were worried about you." My mother said nothing. At work, I pulled my parents' files, trying to find clues to why they were so difficult. Getting information out of strangers was easy. Not so with my parents. Now on the table, those files looked rifled. "The door was blocked last night," I said. "Didn't you hear me?" "I didn't hear anything," Father said. He spoke to the air. "My wife, did you hear anything?" "Nothing," she said from the stove. I straightened the files. "I suppose you two have gone deaf now." My mother shuffled to the table with bowls of porridge. I asked, "But why was the door blocked? You aren't afraid of me, are you?" "Afraid of you?" my mother asked. "Why would we be afraid of you?" my father said. My mother said, "The loudspeaker said the American Navy was conducting aggressive military exercises off the coast. You can't take any chances," my father said. "With the Americans, you must take measures." They blew on their food and took quiet spoonfuls. "How is it," I asked my mother, "that you can cook so well without your sight?" "I can feel the heat that comes off the pan," she said. "And as the food cooks, the smell changes." In my mother's file was a photo of her young. She was a beauty, perhaps the reason she was brought to the capital from the countryside. But what got her sentenced to a factory, rather than assigned as a singer or hostess, was not in her record. I ruffled the folders in the air. "There were some papers on the table," my father said, his voice nervous. "They fell to the floor," my mother said. "We picked them up." "It was an accident," my father said. "Accidents happen," I told him. "Those papers," my mother said, "were they work-related?" "Yes," my father said. "Were they part of the case you're working on?" "Just research," I said. "It must be important files if you brought them home," my father said. "Is anyone in trouble? Perhaps someone we know?" "What's going on here?" I asked. "Is this about Mrs. Kwok? Are you still mad at me for sending her off? She was stealing coal from the furnace. In winter, we were all colder because of her selfishness." "Don't get mad," my mother said. "We were just showing concern for the unlucky souls in your files." "Unlucky?" I asked. "What makes you call them unlucky?" They both went silent. Slowly, I waved my mother's file once before her eyes, yet she made no track of it. Then I fanned her with the file. When the breeze moved across her face, she recoiled, inhaling with fright. "What is it?" my father asked. "What happened?" She said nothing. "Can you see me, Mother?" I asked. "It's important that I know if you can see me." She faced my direction, though her eyes were without focus. "Can I see you?" she asked me. "I see you as I first saw you, in glimpses through darkness." "Spare me the riddles," I warned her. "I need to know." "You were born at night," she said. "I labored all day, and when darkness fell, we had no candles. You came by feel into your father's hands. My father lifted them, scarred by machine looms. 'These hands,' he said." Such was the year Juche 62, my mother said. Such was life in a factory dorm. Your father lit match after match. One after another, he said, until they were all gone. "I touched every part of your body," my mother said. "At first to see if you were whole, and then to know you. So new you were, so innocent. You could have become anyone. It took a while until first light that we got a look at what we had created. I need to be able to trust you, I told her. I cannot have you lying to me. My mother ignored this. Our eyes do not work. That is the answer to your question. But then as now, we do not need sight to see what you have become. Okay, let's